1, and we shall end with the last question, question C. So question 1 says, it's a bit straightforward. I'm hoping that we are all conversant. So this is what I was saying again. Please know your corporate governance, your committees. Yeah, know your committees. So this is question 2. Yeah, question 2 of the 2019 what is 2019 yeah, 2019 exam, corporate governance. Okay, so the question says, explain the function and roles of a risk committee within an effective corporate governance framework, and discuss the advantages which a risk committee could add to the governance of Bathwell Limited. So you have two questions in one there. The first question is, you have to discuss the roles, the functions and the roles of a risk committee. The second question is, you have to discuss the advantages. By the way, it's not just listing. So here you have to explain actually, and please just pay attention to, once again, I'm going to repeat what I said before. When you're answering questions like these, for all the questions you're going to ever answer for this course, as long as it's Dr. Kamang who is going to ask you and say the paper, you really have to do some explaining for your questions. So here you have to explain the functions and the roles of a risk committee, and also you have to discuss the advantages which a risk committee could add to the governance of Bathwell Limited. So what are the roles and functions of a risk committee? Yeah, what are the roles and functions of a risk committee? I'm trying to join using my other gadget. Okay, so first of all, you have to know, or you have to remember, what is a risky committee. I mean, that is a basic. It might sound far-fetched, but it's the first thing you must know. You have to recall, you have to know, you have to remember what is a risk committee. Now, what is a risk committee? You know that from a risk committee, the responsibilities, at least of a risk committee in corporate governance, is to oversee, for example, the company's management policies and procedures. That is the basic fundamental function of a risk committee. Yeah. So now, once you have identified those functions, we are going to do that step by step. Once you have identified those functions, most likely the functions and the roles are going to be mirrored in the advantages. So whatever you're going to put most likely as a function in your role, you have to explain what is the advantage, for example, of that function in the role. So it's an easier question to approach from that point of view. So once you do that, you can now proceed and do your second part. So now, what is the function and the roles of a risky committee? That is what we are trying to answer. So here, we have the function and the roles of function and roles of a risky committee. Yeah, so these are the function and roles of a risk committee. So now, a risk committee, as a part of corporate governance, is given the sole responsibility of overseeing an organization's risk management framework. That is the overall function of a risk committee. It is given, or it is mandated with overseeing an organization's risk management framework. So this is the overall function, at least the overall basic function of a risk committee. So it oversees an organization's risk management. Yeah, I'm not going to be writing everything, so please just follow my voice. Framework. Yeah, so this is the overall function of a risk committee. Now, what are the roles of what are the important roles of a risk committee? So, number one, we are going to say risk governance. So, risk governance is the first important role of a risk committee. Now, when we say risk governance, what do we mean? So we know that risk governance basically involves an organization, not an organization, a risk committee establishing policies in order that they might be able to identify, assess, and manage their risks. So that is so they have to establish policies so that they'll be able to identify, assess, and manage their risks. And those risks can be, can be your strategic risks, it can be your operational risks, or it can be your financial risk, or it can be any risk which is compliance related. So that is the first key role of a risk committee. If you have a question, you can feel free to unmute and just ask, because I'm using a PowerPoint, so I may not be able to see the hand in case it's been raised. Or risk governance. So risk governance, I was saying that for risk governance, this means the risk committee establishing the policies so that they can be able to identify, assess, and manage the risks. So you basically, as a risk committee, you sit down, you establish the policies, and those policies will help you to identify, assess, and manage risks. If you can't define your KPIs, for example, you want to know what risks are attached to a certain project. So unless you identify your key performance indicators, unless you have a policy of identifying, or unless you have a policy of how you want to identify and to assess and manage risks, you will not be able to succeed as an organization. Yeah, that is why depending on which industry you are, for example, if you are in finance, climate risks might not be extremely as important as someone who is in agriculture. So you must have those policies that will be able to guide you. So you have to have a risk committee. That risk committee is going to govern your risk appetite basically. Yeah, which is the second key role of the risk committee. It is the organization's risk appetite. So the organization's risk appetite alignment. Yeah, the organization's risk appetite alignment. So what do we mean by organization's risk appetite alignment? So the risk committee must ensure that the risks that are being taken by management, by the executive team of the organizations, are in alignment with the board's defined risk appetite. If the board of directors tells ZESCO not to invest in solar, the ZESCO MD must not go ahead and invest in solar, because that is not the risk appetite of the shareholders of which the board of directors is representing. So a risk committee is responsible of making sure that the executive team is in alignment with the risk appetite of the board of directors. A very good example here is we have a lot of examples. For example, Lehman Brothers. When Lehman Brothers was established, it was one of the very big banks in the 1980s. But in 2008, I think it was the first bank to collapse. Why? Because they had, I mean, their leverage by there was about, is it 40 to 1 or 30 to 1, which means that overstretched their debt. They had so much debt that once people, shareholders wanted their money back, they could not cover up all the debt which they had. So they had to declare bankruptcy. Yeah, because their risk appetite, the risk appetite of management might not have aligned with the risk appetite of the shareholders. And sometimes, if a risk committee is not as aggressive as in that case of Lehman Brothers, that is the ultimate end of all the banks and all the institutions. It happened recently also with Silicon Bank, 2 years ago. Same thing. So the risk committee must aggressively make sure that, ensure rather, that whatever the executive team is working on, whatever risks they are taking, is in alignment with the board of directors. So that is what we mean by risk appetite alignment. Number 3, we can talk about the basic function, which is monitoring and reporting. So monitoring and reporting. So what do we mean by monitoring and reporting? So the risk committee must regularly review their risk exposures. Now, what are these risk exposures? Risk exposures can mean things like foreign exchange risk, as in the case that we are dealing with right now, the case of Bethel. So a risk committee must make sure that what risks is this company exposed to. So they must monitor those risks. Are you facing your operational risk? Are they foreign exchange risk if your company is a multinational or a transnational company? So you must make sure that you monitor the risks, and then once you monitor the risk, you must be able to report back to your board of directors. So that is number 3. That is a third third key role of a risk committee: to monitor and to report the risk. You monitor and then you report. Number 4, we can talk about so number 4, we can talk about crisis preparedness. Crisis preparedness. Yeah, for you who have been privileged to work in board of directors, you probably are very familiar with this. In fact, just to digress a bit, when I think when is it when Biden entered office, it was 2019, I think 1920, yes, 19. When he entered office, the first thing they blamed the previous administration was that they had forsaken what Obama had done, because Obama had a prepared manual of how to encounter a pandemic. They had a manual actually of how you can respond to a pandemic in case it occurs. So they were blamed that they never followed any page of that manual. So, but a risk committee must make sure that it develops. So here, when we are talking about risk crisis preparedness, we are basically talking about a risk committee developing contingency plans for emerging crisis. So a risk committee develops contingency plans for emerging risks. Yeah. So that can be, for example, things to do with the currency volatility, like in the case that we are dealing with. So you must be able to develop that plan in case there is a sudden surge in the exchange rate. What can we do? Have we hedged our risky exposure? How have we hedged our risk exposure? What if your exchange rate drops? What happens to our debtors or our creditors? So we must be able to develop those contingency plans. So those are we can leave it here for now on the key roles. There are a lot of them. You can even check some of them in the corporate governance codes. As I said, you can even give examples of your key corporate governance codes here. You're going to see how we're going to use some of them in the next part. So we have talked about the we have talked about the key roles in the function. Now let us talk about the advantages for Bathwell. So advantages for Bathwell. Now, what? Yes, sir. Yes, crisis preparedness. Yes. Yes. Number 4. Yes. Yes. Okay. Welcome. Yeah. So number 4 is crisis preparedness. That is developing contingency plans for emerging risks such as your currency volatility risks, or it can be supply chain disruptions. You can prepare plans on how you are going to tackle that. So once we've talked about the key roles, let's quickly move on to advantages. So what is the advantage of a risk committee for Bathwell? Now this again is you can mirror it with what we have talked about here. Yeah, so the advantages can be, for example, risk governance. Your committee can be able to govern the risk, but now it must be explicitly stated for Bathwell. So what is the first advantage that you can think about for Bathwell? So the first advantage that you can think about for a risk committee is that a risk committee provides specialized oversight. So this is specialized oversight. Pardon my handwriting. Yeah. So this is specialized oversight. So what do we mean by specialized oversight? Just like all the committees in your, by the way, in case you have been told to give the advantages of a committee, specialized oversight is always going to be in all the committees you have. It can be a risk committee, your audit committee, remuneration committee, or your nomination committee. They all provide specialized oversight. So here we are saying that for Bathwell, a dedicated committee would provide focused expertise on risks like the currency volatility of Oceania, corruption risks, and the supply chain logistics. Yeah, which an audit committee may lack the bandwidth to address. Now, we can slow down and I'll explain what that means. So here we're saying that currently, we know that Bathwell, all the things are being handled by an audit committee. However, we are advising them to adopt a risk committee. Why? Because a risk committee is going to provide a dedicated committee is going to provide Bathwell with focused expertise on risks like the Oceania's currency volatility, that is number 1, corruption risks, and supply chain. Hello? Where? I'm too fast. Okay. All right. So I'll try to slow down. So I was saying that the first advantage of a risk committee for Bathwell is that it provides specialized oversight. Yeah, don't worry very much about writing. Just write what you hear. It's being recorded, so I'll share the recording when I'm done. So we are saying that a dedicated committee is going to provide focused expertise on risks like the Oceania's currency volatility, which Bathwell is prone to since it's operating in the foreign market. So that is the first kind of risk that is that a risk committee will be able to analyze, monitor, and counsel on. Secondly, we have corruption risks, which this oversight committee can help Bathwell analyze, and also supply chain logistics, which an audit committee may lack the bandwidth to address. So, a dedicated committee, once again, we are saying, is going to provide focused expertise on risks like Oceania's currency volatility, corruption risks, and the supply chain logistics, which the audit committee may lack the bandwidth or the expertise to address. So that is the first advantage of a risk committee for Bathwell, specialized oversight. Yeah. If you have an example, please give an example. For example, you can talk about it can be Lehman Brothers, it can be Enron, it can be Carillion, it can be BP Horizon oil spill. All those scandals we've heard of over the years. For example, if we talk about Enron, we can say if assuming that Enron did not have a serious risk committee, we can say that if the risk committee of Enron was specialized in providing oversight, they could have identified the mistakes which the management, especially the CEO and the CFO, were undertaking, and they could have hedged, or they could have prevented or assisted in preventing the ultimate collapse of Enron. Or WorldCom, is it WorldCom? Yes, that telecom company. The same thing happened also. So give examples to just cement the point that you're trying to make. So that is a first advantage. Number two, we can talk about enhanced compliance. Enhanced compliance. Yeah, so don't worry if we are slow. These things come. So the question might not be exactly the same, but it will be a different question. Most likely, you're going to use the same answers. That is what I say. Same thing with research. Yeah, and the financial managers, which is questions repeat. Okay, so what about a specialized enhanced compliance? So what do we mean? So a risk committee will ensure that Bathwell aligns with the global governance codes. Okay? Yeah, for example, a risk committee we can make sure that Bathwell aligns with the King 4 report. And King 4, we have a principle under Principle 11, which mandates board responsibility for risky governance. So we are saying that a risk committee for Bathwell will help, or will assist, or will make sure that Bathwell is in alignment with the global governance codes, such as the King 4 report. And then under King 4, we have principle number 11, which mandates, it's actually a mandate in South Africa, for all for board responsibility for a risky governance. Your board must have a risk committee. Same thing under the Cadbury report. Same thing under the what is the other report? Cadbury, I think Smith cemented on that. The OECD, yes, I think the OECD report, the most recent one, I think from, is it 2022 or 2023 now? So those are important. Yeah. Okay, so that is number 2, enhanced compliance. So now we can also say that since we know in the case study that Bathwell is relying on the audit committee, we can say that Bathwell's reliance on the audit committee risks non-compliance with the best practices, because an audit committee operates under its own framework. I mean, if you're in audit, you might use the IFRS 1, 2, whatever IFRS you have. You can also use the IS standards. But for a risk committee, they use a totally different set of standards. So an audit committee might not give you the correct compliance that you need, which a risk committee would give you. So if you rely on an audit committee to give you risk compliance, it's possible that you are going to miss some of the very important best practices in the industry. So I hope you are okay with that. That is under enhanced compliance. When we talk about enhanced compliance, we can talk about your strategic risk mitigation. Strategic risk mitigation. So strategic risk mitigation. So what are we saying here? So what we are saying under strategic risk mitigation is almost the same thing when we say the monitoring and reporting here. So under strategic risk mitigation, what the risk committee will be able to do for Bathwell is that the risk committee is going to proactively address the Oceania specific risks. So your risk committee is going to address the Oceania's specific risks, such as they might help you hedge your hedge Bathwell's foreign exchange exposure that it has with Oceania. Also, it can control for anti-bribery rather than reactive fixes. So here we're saying that a risk committee is going to proactively address Oceania's specific risks rather than reactive fixes. You are going to be proactive in how you address the risk. If you see that Bathwell is exposed to foreign exchange risk, you as a risk committee can enter in contracts such as a forward contract, it can be a swap contract, it can be a futures contract, but mostly you use swaps and forwards in your foreign exchange exposure. You're going to know, should we use translation when doing our books, or should we use the other kind of risk hedging technique for Forex? So a risk committee, since it's dedicated to ensuring that your organization is cushioned from risk, it will proactively address your specific risk rather than reactive fixes, which an audit committee might be prone to if you give it the responsibility to manage your foreign risk with other countries. So that is what we mean by strategic risk mitigation. The last one, the advantage of having a specific risk committee is that our investors will be confident. So we can talk about investor confidence. Yeah. So we can talk about investor confidence. So if your investors, for example, this is practical for most organizations that have a board of directors or a risk committee. If your investors know that your organization has a risk committee and they know that you demonstrate so they are going to actually know that you demonstrate commitment to a robust governance for your company. So that will give them the confidence to even invest in your organization, because they know that once they invest in your organization, their money, their investment will be protected by the risky committee, who they believe and trust and hope that is actively trying to do what the three things I've mentioned here on top, and many more other advantages. So This is one of the examples. These are the four advantages. You can give a lot more. You can pick some of them from your corporate governance code and put them here. But since we don't have the whole night, we can just bring the four of them here. Then you can expand more if you have. Yeah. So to wrap it up on the advantages, let me give you a best example actually. So if you remember, and many of us will remember the 2008 market crash that happened in the US. So if you used to work for Barclays, for example, you will know that before 2008, Barclays never had an independent risk committee, or it never had a stand-alone risk committee. However, immediately after the 2008 crash, Barclays established a stand-alone, or they established stand-alone risk committees in most of their branches, or in most of their foreign and other branches, so that they might be able to improve the oversight of the debt equity, those leverage, and the corporate governance. Yes, the what do you call it? Capital structure. Yes, capital structure. Yeah. So that actually helped them reduce exposure to speculative risks, so that in case your in case your company is not doing so well, and you are listed on the foreign exchange market, or on the exchange, or on the capital markets, in case your clients think that your organization is not performing very well, they must not be able to react so badly to that underperformance. So your risk committee must make sure that that does not happen. That is what most of the banks did actually after the 2008 crash, to establish confidence in the financial markets. So they established risk committees. It's not the only bank. There are a lot of banks that did that, and a lot of other institutions that did that. So that is about our risk committees, or our risk committee, the key roles and the advantages. So now let us go to B. Yeah, B is simple. It's just 4 marks. So we are going to finish this quite fast. We are going to run through it a bit quicker. So B says, explain the term risky appetite and assess how the risk appetite of Bathwell Limited has influenced both its corporate strategy and the risks it has chosen to bear. Yeah, so that is our question. So we have to explain the risk appetite, and we have to explain, or we have to assess how Bathwell's risk appetite has influenced its strategy and risk. Okay, so what is risk appetite? So risk appetite is the amount and type of risk a company is willing to take to achieve its objectives. So risk appetite is the amount and type of risk a company is willing to take to achieve its objectives. So that is your definition of risk. Once you talk about your definition of risk appetite, you can go on and explain the 3 types of your risk appetite. For example, you have risk neutral, you have risk averse, you have risk seeking. So risk averse is, for example, a company or an individual or an organization that is, or that does not take on so much risk. They avoid. Yes, please. Okay. So I was saying that risk appetite. Are you able to hear me now? Am I clear enough? Okay. So I was saying risk appetite is the amount and type of risk a company is willing to take to achieve its objectives. Yeah, and I was saying, from once you define what risk appetite, you can talk about the three types of risk that you have or that exist at least. So you have three types. You have risky seeking or risk averse, which is an organization that does not actively seek for risky investments. We have risk neutral. So risk neutral is dependent on the amount. So the higher the amount, the higher the risk you are willing to take on. The lower the amount, the lower the amount of risk you are willing to take on. So if a risk neutral organization, the amount of risk appetite you're going to have is proportionate or is proportional to the amount of or to the amount of money that that specific risk gives you. Yeah, so if you're going to draw a diagram for a risk neutral person, it will be something like straight, something like this, where here you have the amount of money, here you have the amount of risk. So this is proportional. It's a proportional. So if the money is a lot, the risk, if the money is a lot, the risk is a lot. If the risk is very low, if the money is very low, then the amount of risk you are willing to take on is also very low. However, if the money is a lot, you're also willing to take on a lot of risk to get that money. Yeah. For a risk-seeking person, their risk increases more than their amount, or the amount they're getting per risk, or the risk is increasing faster than the amount they're getting from that risk. Yeah, so for example, you can have very high risks, for example, but the amount you're getting from that risk is not as good as it is. Now, the reason why people do that is because they are speculating that if they get this risk now, it will, in as much as the money is not a lot today, but in the future, they are hoping that it will be a lot. So that is why individuals or companies might be risky seeking. So now, in terms of Bathwell, what is the amount of risk they are willing to accept? So that is your risk appetite. Now, Bathwell decided to expand into Oceania, which is a risky market. Why? Because of number one, corruption. Number two, currency volatility. So here we have corruption. So we have currency volatility. We have corruption. And we have a very politically charged environment. I'm breaking. Hello, am I audible? I'm still breaking. Okay, alright, I've noticed. Let me just do this quick. The risk appetite of Bathwell seems to be high. Okay? Yeah, so it seems to be high. Yeah. Now, why do we think the risk appetite of Oceania is high? Sort of Bathwell. So why do we think the risk appetite of Bathwell is high? Now we are doing the assessment. We have defined what risk appetite is. Now we are trying to do the assessment, and that assessment is what will be having an influence on the strategy of Bathwell. So we have defined what risk appetite is. That is the level and type of risk an organization is willing to accept to achieve its objectives. Now, Bathwell's risk appetite is high. Why is it high? Number one, their market entry into Oceania So their market entry into Oceania. So here we are saying that despite, and if you go in the question, you can find this in the question. Despite the fact that Oceania is a politically charged environment, or despite the political instability, the corruption, the currency risks, Bothwell still pursued growth in a very volatile market. So this therefore aligns with its expansion strategy. Alright, so that is how it aligns with their strategy. So we are saying that Bothwell's risk appetite is quite high. Why is it high? Number one, we have said that because of their market entry, this is market entry into Oceania. So we are saying that despite the fact that Oceania is politically unstable, there's corruption and currency risks, Bothwell still pursued growth in a very volatile market. Now how does this align now with their strategy? So we are saying that this aligns with their expansion strategy. Yeah. However, it might expose them to reputational and financial risks. So that is the assessment which we are trying to do for this case study. We are saying, and I hope you have heard what I've said. So I was saying that Bothwell rather. So Bothwell entered a market which is extremely risky. Why? Because there's political instability, there's corruption, and then there is currency risks. However, despite all this Bothwell company still entered the market. Now, if you enter that market, it means that your risk appetite is very high. I mean, right now, no one would probably want to set up a company in Ukraine. If your company or organization goes to Ukraine, it means that your risk appetite is miraculously high, very high. Now, that might align, or that aligns, for example, in the case of Bothwell, it aligns with their expansion strategy. However, the disadvantage is that it will expose them, or it exposes them to reputational and financial risks. Imagine setting up a company where there is extremely high corruption, a country where there is a lot of corruption. Yeah, there are countries like that. You can just Google and check the corruption index for is it World Bank or something. They publish those corruption indexes. You can check them. Yeah, and there's Venezuela. You have Ukraine, which was part of the top whatever in those days. So if you set up your company in such a market, it means that your risk appetite is very high, number one. However, your reputation is probably going to be damaged. So that is the first assessment that we make as to their risky appetite. Number two, we are still talking about, we're still doing the assessment of Bothwell. Yeah, we're still doing the assessment on Bothwell. Number two, their risky appetite, their high risk appetite is going to expose them to foreign exchange. So they're going to have a foreign exchange exposure. So what are we saying here? So what we are saying is that these guys, Bothwell, so accepting payments in Oceania dollars, despite Oceania's currency volatility, is reflective of how tolerant Bothwell is to financial risk. Now, the advantage of that is that they can be able to secure high reward contracts, as we have seen. So, in short, what we are trying to answer here is, we know that Bathwell is a highly risk-seeking organization. Now, why do we think it is a high risk-seeking organization? So, these are the reasons why we think Bathwell is a high risk-seeking organization. Time is up, but let's finish and then we conclude. We finish up. Poise is. So we are saying that number one, because of their market entry into Oceania. Number two, you're saying because of the foreign exchange exposure. These guys are accepting payments in Oceania dollars, despite the fact that Oceania's currency is highly volatile. Now, that itself is reflective that Bathwell is tolerant to financial risk. Yeah, which is, of course, getting them high reward contracts. So that is the second reason why they are risk seeking. The last reason is the over. By the all this, you find them in the. You're going to find all the answers in the case study. Most of these, at least. The other one is the over reliance on a single contract. So over reliance on a single contract is our third reason. So here we are saying that this 200, so the 200 room hotel contract is a strategic risk. So the 200 room contract is a strategic risk. Why? Because delays or non-payment could do absolutely destabilize the cash flow for Bathwell. So these guys are taking a leap of faith actually just by getting or trying to pursue getting into that contract. Yeah, so it exposes them to strategic risk. I mean, this hotel can delay or they cannot pay. They can default on paying that amount for the 200 room contract the Bathwell have, which could destabilize the cash flows for Bathwell. Yeah. So now, in conclusion, we can now conclude by saying the influence of their risk appetite. What is the influence of, or what is the influence on the strategy? So how does your risk appetite influence your strategy? For example, if you are risk averse, it is impossible to pursue an expansion strategy. There is an entire topic in next semester, or when you're doing strategic management, that talk about those things. So you find it. But what is the influence? We are still talking about Bathwell. What is the influence on their strategy of? So they are pursuing a high risk appetite strategy or risk appetite. Now, what is the exposure of that? The exposure, so the influence on the strategy is that the high risk appetite drove Bathwell to prioritize growth over stability. They never cared about being stable. All they cared for is to grow. Yeah. However, as we have said, without a risk committee, this appetite is not formally, there's a word you can use, I'm trying to look for it. It is not formally calibrated, aligned. Yes, let's use aligned. So without a risk committee, this appetite is not formally aligned. Yeah, now what that means is it exposes the Bathwell to, it makes it vulnerable rather to unmanaged risk. Yeah, I mean Tesla is an example, by the way. Tesla is an example. Tesla took a huge leap of faith into China. Yeah, when it aggressively expanded into China. So I mean they accepted the regulatory and the political risks of operating in China. And we know Chinese companies. You can't expand into China without partnering up with a Chinese company. And we have corruption, we have all those risks that you might face. Yeah. So we are done with that. Let's conclude in the next few minutes. Yeah, so the last question is easy. This one is mostly, so you have to figure out how to extract questions in the question. So section B is about your, firstly is you being able to remember your notes, internal, so the risks, the committees, the corporate governance codes and all that. Remember them. Secondly, you must be able to extract answers from the question. Yeah, just by reading your question, your case study rather, you must be able to identify answers. They'll be there sometimes not, sometimes they will be there. So the last thing we're going to do is C. C says explain how Bathwell could effectively control the strategic and the operational risks which arise from Oceania supply contracts. So this is about controlling your strategic. So you have your strategic risk and you have your operational risk. So how can you hedge? So first of all, how can you hedge your strategic risk? So let us start with your strategic risks. Yeah, so let us start with your strategic risks. So what are strategic risks? So your strategic risks could be, for example, risk that involve you entering a new market. Yeah, and this market is corrupt. You rely on a single contract, God forbid, but those are your strategic risks. So just give me a second. Let me just do something quickly in 2 seconds. I'll be back very, 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 very soon. I think in less than 20 seconds. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let us continue. Yeah. So we're talking about how can Bathwell hedge its strategic and operational risks. So how can it hedge its strategic and operational risks? So first of all, you have to identify the risks that you have in the question. We have corruption, we have currency, and all that. So how can you, as Bathwell, hedge those risks? So what are the risks that you have, or what are the risks that we identified in the question? Number one, we have our foreign exchange risks. So how do you hedge your foreign exchange risk? This is the first risk, by the way, that we have, or that we can identify easily in the question. We have been told about the foreign currency volatility of Oceania. So how can we hedge it? You can use forward contracts, for example, or options to lock in exchange risks. So that is the first thing that you say. You can say you can use hedging. You can hedge. Yeah, you can hedge. It's by the way, it's a long topic for those doing finance. It's like 3-4 weeks talking about hedging. Yeah, hedging foreign exchange. It's the whole month. Yeah, it's the whole month kind of course, this one. So we won't stress talking about that. Yeah, but you can hedge your foreign exchange risk. What is hedging? Hedging basically means you are locking in your foreign exchange risk. In case, for example, let's say your kwacha is $1 to 28 kwacha. Yeah, this is your indirect translation. So there's direct, there's indirect, but don't care about that. Now let's say you perceive that if you're going to sell something today at 28 kwacha and then get your money later in December, this might have dropped. It would be, for example, $1 to let's say 15 kwacha, assuming it dropped 15 kwacha. Now, if you sold your thing to an international buyer at 28 kwacha, and then the dollar drops to 15 kwacha, the kwacha drops, which means you're going to make a loss. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to hedge this 28 kwacha, so that in case someone pays you in the future, they don't pay you less than they actually got the things for. You still want them to pay you the exact amount they got your things for. So you can either use your forward contracts or you can use your options. Yeah, so those are topics on their own, but just know that that is how the basically works. It's like you're entering into a contract with someone. You agree, I'll sell you something at this amount, I want you to pay me such an amount when the contract expires. So you can use either options or you can use forward contracts to hedge in your foreign exchange risk. So that is what you can say. Yeah. What is the other thing that you can do on foreign exchange? You can request that the company in Oceania pays you, or you can talk about what are called currency clauses. So a currency clause is you can negotiate that the foreign company does not pay you in dollars. They should instead pay you in kwacha, in the Zambian kwacha amount, or the split currencies, the currency that is a bit stable than the kwacha, so that you don't lose the value of your money. Yeah, someone just lost money a few weeks ago because they were paid in dollars. When the dollar just fluctuated that day a bit, they lost about 1,000 kwacha. Yeah, so it's these things are true. So you can request that the company pays you in your local currency, which is a kwacha. So you can have a currency closure or a currency clause in your contract. So this is a first type of this is how you can control the risk. The second thing we have, the second risk rather, we have our political or our political or corruption risks. So how do you hedge your political and corruption risks? So you can do your due diligence, for example. It's the first thing you can do, due diligence. So of course this you won't find them in the notes, so you have to think outside the box if you're going to choose a question like this. Yeah, you won't find them in the notes. I think you won't find strategic risks, foreign exchange risks. So just think outside the box for this. If it comes, good for you. If it doesn't, still good for you, because there's a question that will come that you actually know. So what do we mean by due diligence? So what we mean by due diligence is that you as Bathwell must vet the local partners using frameworks like the ISO 37,000. What do you call it? The ISO 3000. What is the name? It should be the ISO. Let's see. Yeah, you can use the ISO 37001. This. So yeah, to do due diligence on your partners in that foreign country. So that's the first thing that you can do on political risks. The second thing that is actually true is the insurance. Yeah, it is. You can insure. So you can actually purchase political insurance, something that exists. You can purchase political insurance. Yeah. Believe it or not, there's a company in the UK. It's called Lloyd's. Yeah, it's called Lloyd's. Lloyd's can actually cover the contract fluctuations that come as a result of corruption or political risks. So you have that as your risky hedging mechanism. So the third type of risk that would want to cover, the third type of risk that you want to cover is what is called your reputational risk. Yeah, so your reputational risk. So how do you cover? How do you insure your operational risk? You can have your anti-bribery policies. Yeah, so anti-bribery policies. Yeah, so you can have your you can implement your anti-bribery policies in the organization. For example, we have, I think, the Foreign Bribery Act, which was amended a few years ago, I believe. I was reading about that a long time ago, so please, if you can remember it. But I'm sure there's the Anti-Bribery Act. I think the UK has the UK bribery Act. Yeah, the UK Bribery Act. Okay. So you can read about it. But you can ensure that your company, Bathwell, has Anti-Bribery Act just to hedge and protect yourself or to control that risk. Okay. Yeah. Now, what about let's end with these two on our operational risks. So we are almost done. Let's just give it 2 more minutes. We do our operational risk, the risk of operation. So our operational risks, how can you ensure that you control your operational risk which arises from the Oceania supply chain contract? So the first operational risk that we have is the same supply chain delays. You might have delays in your supply chain. So how can you control the delays in your supply chain? So you can control delays in the supply chain by shifting the shipping responsibility to an Oceania importer. Yeah, for you who do import and exports, you know of a CIP. Yeah, I'm sure we yeah, I'm sure most of us are aware of the CIPs. The CIPs, the carriage and insurance paid. Yeah, the carriage and insurance paid. So you can use CIPs or use a foreign importer from that side, so that you hedge, you protect yourself against against supply chain delays. So use a local importer from that country, from Oceania. Number 2, we can talk about payment default, which is the last thing we are going to do today. So payment default. So how can you control for payment default? You can use number 1, letters of credit. Yeah, letters of credit. So you can use letters of credit. Let reputable banks in Oceania recommend or let them guarantee payments. So you can use a letter of credit to do that. You can also do staged deliveries. So they said this is general knowledge. You won't find this in the notes. So just think about common things you can do, practical things you can do if you were to be put in the shoes of a risk committee deciding on these things. Yeah, so you can use the letters of default. You can also do staged deliveries. So stage of deliveries basically mean that you tie the instruments to milestone clearance. So they pay you, you deliver. They pay you, you deliver. Don't deliver all things at once, because if they default on all your on the whole contract, which means you are going to lose a lot of dollars. Yeah, so this is what we have done today. Let's meet tomorrow for research at 17 hours. Yeah, tomorrow we are meeting at 17 hours for research. Yeah, don't worry if you have not been able to follow up. I am going to share the recording